When he discovers that his father is a giant monster that almost destroyed the planet years ago, a young man must decide whether to become the king of the kaijus or use his new powers to protect humanity. Today we're going to recap the story of the movie, Firebreather, from 2010. During the last day of the war between humans and the giant monsters known as kaijus, Margaret Rosenblatt's courage saved the planet. On that day, Margaret also met Belloc, the father of her future son. 16 years later, Duncan has become a teenager and is anxious to find out if he will adapt to his new school. Unlike other young people his age, he eats charcoal for breakfast and has orange skin. However, his mother tries to reassure him and asks Duncan to try to control his anger so that he doesn't get into trouble with his new classmates. Because of his differences, the young man finds it very difficult to make friends, so he walks apprehensive towards school. On the way, he decides to kick a can of soda he sees lying on the sidewalk and accidentally hits a car parked nearby. When the car alarm goes off, Duncan runs off and comes across Jenna. Suddenly, some delinquents approach the girl to try and attract her attention, but Jenna just ignores them and continues on her way. Just then, Troy Adams spots the orange-skinned young man and takes the opportunity to make fun of the newcomer. Then they leave and Duncan tries to control his anger so as not to give in to their provocations. Minutes later, while walking through the school corridors, he bumps into Jenna again and the girl accidentally spills coffee on his jacket. Impressed by his classmate's beauty, the young man says that everything is fine and watches her as she walks away. Just then, Troy appears and threatens the rookie, telling him not to go near his ex-girlfriend, which infuriates Duncan. After his teacher introduces him to the rest of the class, Duncan sits next to Kenny at Isabel's invitation and the three soon strike up a friendship. During science class, the teacher puts a tray with a lifeless frog on each student's desk and Jenna is furious when she finds out that she has to open the animal's body. Immediately, she gets up and starts arguing with the teacher, and Duncan, who is watching the girl, realizes that the animal that has been placed on her desk is no ordinary amphibian. As well as being alive, the creature has a tail and a frightening countenance. In an attempt to distract people from removing the kaiju from the room, Duncan pretends that his frog is alive and puts on a big show. Thanks to his terrible act, he becomes known as the class weirdo and loses points with Jenna. At least the young man manages to save the animal and takes it to safety. As he walks with the kaiju hidden in his jacket, Isabel approaches him and starts asking him some questions, as she has realized that Duncan is no ordinary teenager. Unlike most people, the girl is obsessed with the kaijus and doesn't see them as monsters. She knows that these creatures only attack humans to defend themselves, because men keep trying to eliminate them. Being a keen observer, Isabel notices that Duncan has hidden something in his jacket before leaving the room and asks him to show her what he's hiding. On seeing Gamoraden, the girl is impressed and demonstrates her vast knowledge of kaijus. After biting Duncan's hand, the creature runs away, as it is terrified of humans. During physical education class, the young man meets Colonel Barnes, his guardian, who has accompanied him since his last school. In the very first game, Duncan becomes a member of Troy's rival team and sees the group of delinquents take down all their opponents. However, when Kenny is about to be shot, Duncan steps in front of his friend and protects him. He then fights off all his opponent's attacks with ease, which makes the bullies curious as to how he was able to acquire such skill. After holding the third ball in the air, Duncan has the chance to strike back and hits all of them into Troy's face. Minutes later, in the locker room, the coward gathers his gang to help him take revenge on Duncan and the young man asks Kenny to leave so he doesn't get hurt. After his friend leaves, Duncan ties the laces of his sneakers and runs away because he promised his mother he wouldn't fight at school anymore. He knows he has enough strength and fighting ability to take down all those guys single-handedly, but he decides to keep his promise. After leaving the court, Duncan runs through the school and holds onto the ceiling beams to avoid being caught. During the chase, the young man ends up in the library and runs over the bookshelves to escape. However, Troy doesn't give up on catching him and, when he realizes that the young man is in trouble, Barnes decides to act. At that moment, Duncan comes up against the end and is cornered. He tries to convince his enemy to leave, but Troy is determined to finish him off. Furious, Duncan starts spraying fire out of his mouth and frightens his opponent. Suddenly, Barnes appears and uses his hand to cover Duncan's mouth, then orders Troy back into the room. The man then accompanies the half-breed to the school bus, which is actually just a hiding place for his ship. Hours later, they arrive at a secret laboratory to investigate why Duncan has started spitting fire. After some tests, Dr. Alexandrine reveals that Duncan's strength and abilities have been increasing over time and he has now acquired a new power. Over time, the young man will know how to control it, but in the meantime, he needs to stay away from major conflicts. Just then, Margaret appears and is furious when she discovers that Barnes has taken her son to the laboratory. She hired the company where the colonel works to ensure that Duncan has the chance to live the life of a normal teenager, which means keeping him away from anything to do with the kaijus. When he returns to school, Barnes goes to the principal's office to explain why Duncan was able to spit fire and uses a few grains of gunpowder to act out what happened. Furious, Troy claims that the fire came out of Duncan's mouth, but since the director knows he's a big troublemaker, he doesn't give any credence to what the young man is saying. To repair the conflict between the two students, Dave orders them to clean the cafeteria together, otherwise they will be suspended. Just then, Isabel shows up and invites Duncan to a party on Saturday. Normally, this isn't the young man's favorite kind of program, but when he finds out that Jenna will also be attending this event, he decides to go. When she finds out that her son has been invited to a party, Margaret is relieved that Duncan is finally able to socialize like a normal teenager. After saying goodbye to his mother, the young man leaves the house and goes to Lana's as the girl's parents are traveling. When he gets there, he finds Jenna and realizes that the girl is very sad. All her classmates are furious with her because Jenna has lost all the money the class was collecting for the welcome party. The young woman kept the money in her closet, but someone stole it and she has no idea who it is. Frustrated, Jenna decides to leave, then Isabel approaches and hands Duncan a drink. At this point, some of the guests start screaming as they see countless Gamoradons walking around the party. Suddenly, the ground begins to shake and the earthquake causes cracks in the ground. Then Belloc appears and, on seeing the kaiju, all the students flee in despair. Determined to save his friend, Duncan takes Isabel to a hideout and reveals that the monster is his father. Surely, the king of the kaijus has decided to appear there after 16 years because he is looking for his son. When Belloc approaches, Duncan orders Isabel to flee, but the monster manages to capture her with its tail. Furious, Duncan hits his father with a motorcycle, but the attack has no effect. So he lures the creature away in order to give his friend the chance to escape. During his escape, the young man ends up being hit by Belloc's flames, but he doesn't suffer any injuries. Just then, the kaiju manages to capture him and takes the young man back to his hiding place. Upon arriving at the cave, Belloc reveals to his son that, long before the human race existed, the kaiju already lived on Earth. While walking through the place, Duncan steals a small crystal and hides it in his pocket. Soon after, he orders Belloc to take him back home, but his father tries to convince him to stay and become a real king. In the future, Duncan will have to take his father's place and rule over all the kaijus, because there will be a war between his race and the human race. Belloc then takes his son to meet some of his most loyal subjects and presents him as heir to the throne. However, Abaddon and Astaroth don't accept the idea of being ruled by a young man with a human appearance and claim that Belloc is shaming their kind. Furious, the king asks if any of them will dare to challenge him, because he knows that none of those kaijus can beat him in a fair fight. Belloc then throws his son into a pool of lava and, when he finally manages to get out, Duncan looks terrifying. After throwing a large amount of fire at the ceiling of the cave, the young man collapses and wakes up alone in the middle of the desert. After that terrible experience, the scales covering his skin are even more apparent and orange in color. Minutes later, he arrives at Kenny's trailer and is surprised to realize that his friend isn't surprised by his new appearance. While the two friends are talking, Kenny receives a phone call and Margaret is finally able to talk to her son. Seeing the physical changes caused to her son's body after his encounter with Belloc, Margaret becomes very worried and says she can't wait for Colonel Barnes to capture the giant. Although she didn't agree with Belloc's choices, Margaret said she loved him very much, because when she met him he was a kind creature who had been through a lot of suffering. However, over time, the kaiju has allowed all the resentment he harbors towards humanity to corrupt him and now he needs to be stopped. The next day, when he arrives at school, Duncan is surprised by the reaction of his classmates. Instead of being judged and rejected by them because of his appearance, Duncan feels welcomed and realizes that, for the first time in his life, he is welcome somewhere other than home. All this thanks to Isabel, who told the whole school that Duncan had lured Belloc away from the party and saved everyone with his heroic act. That afternoon, when Jenna opens her cupboard, she finds an envelope and, upon opening it, comes across the stone that Duncan stole from his father's cave. If she manages to sell it, the girl will have more than enough money to pay for her homecoming party and regain her popularity at school. During the break, Duncan approaches Jenna and manages to strike up a conversation with her. Thanks to Isabel's story, the girl no longer thinks Duncan is a weirdo and accepts his invitation to be his date at the party. After the lesson, Barnes takes Duncan back to the lab in the hope that Dr. Alexandrine will have a solution to fix his skin. However, during the trip, They both end up in an accident and Barnes has to eject his seat so that they don't perish in the explosion. The problem is that Duncan ends up falling and, during his fall, spots a kaiju waiting for him on the ground. Terrified, the young man begins to transform involuntarily and starts a duel against the creature. After breaking one of his enemy's fingers, Duncan is attacked, but manages to destroy all the rocks that hit his body and punches the monster. Seeing the fight, Barnes sends a call for help to the base and requests the presence of all containment units. During the duel, Duncan spots his father and realizes that he is being tested by him, so he uses his fire breathing to take down his opponent. Belloc knows that if his son doesn't prove his strength, he will never be respected by the kaijus, so he decides to put him in a duel against his will so that he can prove himself worthy of ruling. Just as Duncan was about to eliminate the creature, Barnes' army launched an attack and began firing at Belloc. At that moment, the king of the monsters takes his son to safety and eliminates most of the soldiers with his fire breathing. Determined to eliminate the kaiju once and for all, Barnes climbs into a battle tank and starts shooting, but Belloc explodes the machine and captures the colonel. Realizing that this conflict will never end, Duncan decides to intervene and tries to help the two sides create a peace treaty. However, something unexpected happens. Belloc, the one who hates the human race the most, decides to surrender and ends up being arrested. A few days later, the night of the welcome party arrives and Duncan goes to pick Jenna up from home. To the girl's surprise, his date has taken his friends with him and it's Margaret who will take them to the event. During the party, Isabel sits and watches her suitor dance with another girl. Since the first day of school, she has had a love interest for Duncan, but has never had the courage to reveal it to him. On the other hand, Kenny, her childhood friend, has always been in love with Isabel, but he hasn't said anything to her either. In the middle of the night, Director Dave announces the king and queen of the party. Troy and Jenna are the chosen ones and have to go on stage to receive their crowns. While the king and queen dance together, Isabel sees an opportunity to get close to Duncan and asks him to dance. At this point, Kenny is furious and decides to break up the couple. He starts an argument with Duncan and tells everyone that he is Belloc's son. On hearing this, Jenna orders the young man to stay away from her and Duncan leaves. Frustrated, the young man isolates himself in a room and accidentally starts a small fire. While trying to put out the fire, he burns the sleeve of his suit and doesn't even realize that the kaijus are invading the party. It all starts with the arrival of the Gamorodons. Then the other giant monsters show up and destroy the ballroom. During her escape, Isabel twists her foot and falls to the ground. Seeing his friend in danger, Kenny risks his life to attract the monster's attention and ends up being captured. Just as the young man was about to be eliminated, Duncan appears and throws a metal bar at the kaiju. After striking the giants, he goes to check that his friend is all right and, before collapsing, Kenny asks for forgiveness for having revealed Duncan's secret to the whole school. To ensure the safety of his friends, the young man returns to battle and lures the creatures into the desert. Meanwhile, Margaret enters the ship to help her son and Jenna decides to accompany her, as she wants to make amends for the way she treated Duncan. In an attempt to discover the motive for the attack, Margaret takes her gun and goes to pay Belloc a visit. She asks if it was he who sent Abaddon and Astaroth to eliminate her son, but the king of the kaijus says that those two are traitors who won't accept Duncan as their future king. When he realizes that the young man's life is in danger, Belloc breaks free from prison and goes after the traitors. At that moment, Barnes' army tries to stop him from leaving, but Belloc manages to get past them all and continues on his way to the city. Immediately, the colonel grabs his jetpack to chase him down and finds Duncan. Furious, the man points a gun at him and blames the young man for all the damage, because Belloc came back because of him. Suddenly, Abaddon and Astaroth appear and Barnes is captured. He is about to be devoured alive when Duncan leaps in and manages to rescue the colonel before he falls into the kaiju's mouth. During the fall, a pair of wings appears on the back of the heir to the throne and Duncan manages to fly over the desert. After leaving Barnes in a safe place, Duncan returns to the battlefield and attacks his enemies with fireballs. However, he still has no experience in battle and ends up being trapped. The young man is about to be eliminated when his father appears and attacks Abaddon. Just then, Astaroth approaches and the two traitors join forces to dethrone the king of the kaijus. Determined to help her ex-husband, Margaret throws the ship into one of those monsters and uses a parachute to escape with Jenna before the explosion. Seeing his father about to be eliminated, Duncan manages to free himself and uses his body as bait to make his enemies accidentally attack each other. He then flies towards the mountains and uses his firepower to trigger an avalanche. The young man trusts that his father will be able to protect his mother and rescues Jenna so that she doesn't get hit by the snow. At that moment, the two kaijus end up falling off the cliff and dying, while Duncan and his family manage to survive. After the battle, Belloc agrees to go back to prison and asks his son to stay with Margaret for the time being. When the time is right, the kaiju says he will come back for him and then says goodbye to Duncan. Before returning home, Jenna apologizes for the way she treated her partner and says that she will be waiting for him at school on Monday. Now that he has a pair of wings, Duncan no longer needs aircraft to get around and decides to fly home on his own. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.